right. You know the priest has had a busy week when he's got to read his homily straight from the binder. That's bound to happen sometimes. So it's Divine Mercy Sunday, as I said at the beginning of Mass. And our gospel reading was a perfectly reasonable one. Whose sins you forgive are forgiven them, and whose sins you retain are retained. Now, I am quite confident that you have heard several talks about this sort of thing with respect to you, yourself, and other individuals. So today we're going to shake it up. We're going to talk about this in terms of the entire church. And we're going to go all the way back into church history and explore how the forgiveness of sins leads to divine forgiveness and how mercilessness brings about its own punishment. We're going to go all the way back to 1773. In 1773, the Council of Trent was fairly recent news, and the Catholic Church was dealing with a strange new world. On one side, secularism was on the rise, with pretty much every ruler on the planet trying to control the church through political pressure. That was new, relatively anyway. And on the other side, Protestantism was now a thing, and it was clear now that it was not a fad. It was not going away. It was here to stay. And so loyal Catholics were scared. They didn't know how to proceed. You know, what does it mean to be Catholic when non-religious people have all the power and Protestants have freedom of worship without fear of reprisal? You know, it seemed like being Catholic was the worst of both worlds. And that brings us to our two main characters of today's story, the Jesuit order and the Jansenist order. The Jansenists were very much products of their time. They were what we call counter-Reformation Catholics. So they're people that believe that the solution to the Protestant crisis was to be extreme Catholics, you know, to be extra firm in purpose and devoutness and rules and regulations, because that's what the Protestants had left behind, the structure of the church and the devotionalism that went along with that. So I realize that's kind of an unfair summary, but give me a break. I'm summing up a church movement in 1 minute. That's the Jansenists. The Jesuits were an order, and they were determined to live out their lives as Christ-like as possible. And they were known for their devotion to the Pope. But unlike the Jansenists, they were pretty easygoing when it came to the rules and the regulations. You know, some might say they were lax in way of following rules and traditions of the church. So the Jesuits and the Jansenists both dearly loved the church, but they had almost opposite values when it came to what they thought was the best way to be a good Catholic. So after a little while, the Jansenists started getting into trouble with church leadership because the Jansenists, they were so strict. They started saying things like a person's free will had nothing to do with their salvation. Not true, by the way. And they also said, because again, they were so strict, they started saying that a very small amount of people actually get to heaven. Also not the teaching. So, you know, they were getting a little zealous in their own personal teachings. And the Pope around that time said, Jansenists, knock it off. And so, of course, the Jansenists argued back to the Pope, always a great idea. And so, you know, there's this inner church turmoil going on. And at the same time, the secular world was just hating the Jesuit order more and more every day, because nothing ticks off the secular world like loyal Catholics actually making the world a better place. Ooh, that drives them crazy. The Jesuits were doing things like they were defending American natives as if they were, you know, people like anybody else. They were saying, no, those Native Americans, they're people. They have all the rights that us people of European descent we have. Like, we're equals in the eyes of God. Not everybody was saying that sort of thing in 1773. Imagine how much the slave trade would have loved to destroy the Jesuits for that reason alone. In addition to all that, the Jesuits were well organized, which means they had money and resources. So basically the entire world was turning on the Jesuits out of jealousy. And in 1773, unfortunately, the Pope was forced to abolish the Jesuit order out of political pressure. And the Jansenists could not have been happier. They were so happy the Jesuit order was getting destroyed. They helped purge them out of France. The Jesuit order was big in France. And it was just so sad. And the Jesuit general, so he wasn't the Pope, but he was the head Jesuit. He said, guys, my fellow Jesuits, accept the abolishment. We are loyal to the Pope. We're going to follow his decision, as sad as it is. Obey the Pope. And that Jesuit general, he died in a church prison as a reward for his loyalty. But the Jesuits followed his instructions. Even then, they forgave their oppressors, just like Jesus on the cross. Now, here's the thing. The Jesuits and the Jansenists were actually pretty similar. If I had a Jesuit on one side of me and a Jansenist on the other, they would both punch me in the face at the same time for saying that, which would prove my point. They had a lot in common, more than they would admit. They were both pioneers. They were trying to renew Catholicism in a world that had apparently outgrown it. Doesn't that sound familiar? They took risks and they tried new things. They both valued loyalty to the Pope, although for different reasons. Now, plenty of good people today like the Jansenists. They had some good ideas. They made some positive, lasting impressions upon the church. That much is true. But the Jansenists were more or less a merciless take on Christianity. That's the reason I'm not much of a fan. And they're not a thing anymore. You're not a Jansenist in this day and age and a loyal Catholic at the same time. Their teachings, taken entirely, is not compatible with Catholicism. And the Jesuits, they also had some good ideas, and they were also responsible for some major blunders, throughout the church history. They're not perfect people by a long shot, but they were loyal and forgiving, even in the face of betrayal. And they were abolished from the face of the earth for about 50 years. And they were restored when European politics changed, because that's what happens with politics. It changes. And they've had their ups and downs since then as the decades have gone by, but they are still here. They are still a thing, and I am deeply grateful that Pope Francis is one of their number. We're talking about forgiveness, remember? Jesus himself promised that forgiveness returns back to us in the end. That's really what that gospel was about today. The Jansenists may have literally never forgiven anyone anything. And they received just as little mercy as a result. The Jesuits showed forgiveness when it mattered the most. And the world remembered that about them. And they were vindicated in the eyes of what history books would consider the blink of an eye. I mean, 50 years? That is nothing in the context of history. So I want you to think about this. I want you to think about this when you're lost in your own righteous ways. When you are holding a grudge because you're so sure that you're right and your enemies are so wrong. We all think like that sometimes, myself included. But if you ask Father Justin, how do you know? How do you know that forgiveness actually matters? How do you know that forgiveness actually makes any difference in the life today? How do you know that? Well, when you look at the facts, when you crack open the history books, unrepentant, unforgiving people, they don't seem to last any longer than their ability to hold on to power. Those people exist in an all or nothing struggle. And when their power is gone, there is nothing else that sustains them. Divine Mercy Sunday, it's about being better than that. Divine Mercy Sunday is about seeing the good and the bad in yourself and others, and it's realizing that there's more to life than winning and losing. It's like being like the Jesuits. It's about being Christ with every breath you take, even if it might be your last.